All right. Looks like we are, in fact, live. Go ahead, say something, Allison. Let me see if I can hear you.
Something Allison.
There we go.
Allison Dickson. Yeah.
Allison something.
I did that with Brett when I was like, I'm like, say, hey, I'm Brett. What's up? He
Mhm.
did.
He's like, say what? Say, Brett, what's up?
Yeah. I was like, say, hey, I'm Brett. What's up? And he was like, hey, I'm Brett. What's up? I
I
still
love
have it
that.
somewhere.
Yeah,
Uh,
I had a blast with my episodes with him. Those were so much fun. He's such a
yeah.
great guest. He
Oh,
really
definitely. Yeah, makes it so much easier. All
Um,
right.
okay, so I do the intro, right? Is that the
Mm,
game?
yeah, man.
Um, Let me say hello to the people. Hello to the people.
Hello, people.
I don't know if there are people, but I'm saying hello to them
You
just in case.
know, it might filter in late, but we'll get him here one way or the other.
Okay, so I'll just go ahead and get started.
Okay.
This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jayson Blair.
And this is Allison Dickson of the Vintage Vilains podcast.
Just a little more than a month after her 12th birthday, on Saturday, while most of the town of Asotin, Washington, was a few miles away at the Asotin County Fairgrounds in southwest Washington state, Christina White decided to ride her 10-speed bike down the hill on Jefferson Street to her friend Rose's house. She never returned home. More than 45 years later, what happened to Christina that day is still shrouded in mystery.
Hello, everybody. I just want to say, first of all, to Jayson, thank you very much for bringing me on with you to cover this case. I know it's one you've been passionate about for a long time, and you've discussed little bits and pieces of it with me over the time we've been friends the last couple of years. But uh, once I started digging into this, I was not prepared for the journey that I was going to be taking. So I just want to say that first and foremost. And I also, as we get into this, and we're going to be referencing a lot of materials, there are a lot of people that have been following this case and investigating this case and following the trail of the person we're going to be talking about tonight. And of course, credit goes to the Snake River Killer podcast, which I've been listening to on Marathon for the last few days here. Fantastic work by Brandon Schran and his team. And also the documentaries Confluence and Cold Valley, which feature Detective Jackie Nichols and investigator Gloria Crow-Boberts, among others, who have been doing the work of this case.
Yeah, and it's been neat. So, you mentioned, I've been mentioning it to you for a couple of years. It's a hard case to sum up for people. And so I give them like a general overview of it, and they're like, wow, that sounds unbelievable. Then I tell them a little bit more. Then I tell them a little bit more, and they're like, this is totally unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just been a fascinating journey. I think I got pulled into the case through the documentaries Confluence and Cold Valley. But eventually I was lucky enough to have Gloria on my podcast for an interview. And Gloria is the cousin of one of the victims in the case, Christina or Christy Nelson. And then I also had the chance to have Brandon on, where we had a really great episode that went beyond the case and sort of his motivations for writing, his motivations for covering the case. And one of the things that he really focused on was his two daughters and imagining that something like that could happen or would happen to his two daughters. And, this case is where we have a prime suspect who is still out there living his best life, right?
Right.
And so it makes it scary in a different way, I think, than some other cases. And I had the chance to also have Detective Jackie Nichols on to talk about both the case and missing persons cases in general and cross-jurisdictional issues that show up in this case. I was lucky enough in October of last year, right before my mom passed away, and I was planning on canceling the trip, and she was sick, and she was like, Jayson, no, go live your life. But I went to Idaho and Washington to look into this case, also the University of Idaho murders, where I found there was crossover between the two in terms of where Brian Koberger went on the day after the murders involved some of the sites of these killings. But I want to give special credit to Brandon. Snake River Killer podcast is amazing. The team that Brandon has put together is amazing. We're lucky enough that we're going to have two of his researchers, Cathy Belben and Samantha Sawyer, on.
I'm so excited. Since I've heard them on the show, I feel starstruck almost. Can't wait.
Yeah, they're really amazing. Like it's amazing to watch them work and the things that the puzzles they're able to solve. And then Julia Cowley is joining us for the third episode, which is going to be great, to really look at a profile of the unknown subject that is likely to be responsible for these crimes. And then we're going to be able to match it up and see where it matches and it doesn't with the prime suspect. So I, when I went up there, one of the things that became very clear to me is, even though, these go back decades and decades, it's still very much an active investigation. And the hotel I was staying in Lewiston was right across from the FBI resident agency field office. And a lot of FBI investigations are run out of Salt Lake City, and they have these resident offices. People were being interviewed there as I was there about the case. So it's very much active.
Yeah. And I also wanted to, with the Snake River Killer podcast, Brandon and I kind of a kinship with him because he is a writer into the literary arts and linguistics and attacks this story from the point of view of a storyteller in a lot of ways. And I can relate to that myself with the I also try to look at true crime in terms of that zoom to look at all the details and, and stuff like that. So, and the clues that he finds along the way and the things that he pays attention to, I can see that he looks at it from the point of view of a writer as we consider all the little elements that go to something. So that really pulled me in, and his storytelling is great. The way he weaves in the historical context of what we're talking about, because as Jayson said, this is still very much an active case. This goes back. We're going back to 1979 at the start of this. And so we're going to be covering 45 years. And I only know how to do that because I was born that year. So this case is active since I've been alive.
Actually, we're going back to like the 1960s.
You're absolutely right. We're not going to start. We are going to work a little bit further. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So, the backstory for me is I came across a case in 2019, about 1 year after the documentary Cold Valley sort of explored this string of murders and disappearances that occurred in what's called the Lewis-Clark Valley area. And it's an area of Washington State and Idaho that's not far from, obviously, the borders of those states, but also the Nez Perce reservation. It's not even that far from Oregon either. Montana's a little bit of a hike, but it's not that far there. And sort of the centerpiece of the valley is Clarkston, Washington to the west and Lewiston, Idaho to the east. They're really sister cities that emerge at the confluence of the Snake River and the Clearwater River. And so the Snake River heads north to south, and then it turns west at Clarkston and Lewiston's northern edge. And the Clearwater heads east from Lewiston's edge. So if you follow the Snake River south for a little under 6 miles, you pass, it was an amazing drive. You pass these beautiful green mountains and hills, unbelievably blue waters. The Snake River is so wide, it's amazing. And you reach this town of Asotin, Washington, where Christina White lived with her mother, her stepfather, and her sister. And, if you, going back to sort of my visit in 2023, 2023, it is the thing that sticks out to me about it is the vastness of it. Like when I look at it on a Google map, it looks very, very compressed. But, you realize you're getting this two-dimensional image, and there are spots where on Google Maps, it looks like it's, I don't know, 50 feet away, but you don't realize that you're like climbing a mountain in between or a giant hill. So like something that appears on the map to be 50 feet away is so far. And one of the things that Jackie was telling me is this is part of the reason the Pacific Northwest is like, for the roaming serial killers, it's like heaven.
Yes.
Because there are ravines that in our lifetimes will never be explored. There are spots that are just very, very difficult to get to. One of the wild things when I was there looking at one of the bridges that we'll talk about later is I ran into the grocery store that Brian Koberger supposedly went to after the day after the University of Idaho murders. And I'm standing at this like coffee shop, and he was caught on tape in the grocery store. There's this shack of a coffee shop out there, and I'm standing in it, and I'm like, why on earth would he go here? And then I turn and I'm like, oh, there's the Snake River. Like, it was like from the middle of the parking lot, maybe like 70, 75, 100 feet away. And I was like, well, I think I know where the knife is. And I think we're never going to find it.
Yeah, I think anything that goes in there is
it's so deep. It's huge.
And it's about, we'll cover it a little more later, but it's about 300 feet wide in some places. So massive. And, I lived, as a lot of people know, I lived in Olympia, Washington for about a decade through the 2000s, and got a lot of experience of that part of the country. And yes, you nailed it perfectly, Jayson, the vastness. People who haven't been out in the American West very much, it's hard to appreciate it until you're out in it. Being myself from the Midwest and having more experience with the eastern coast of the United States, it's a whole other experience. And you're absolutely right; it's beautiful. I've driven. I don't know if I drove through this particular part when I drove from Washington to Ohio when we moved out here, but we did drive through Idaho, more through Coeur d'Alene, the Panhandle area.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. So
up north.
And so, it's really hard to imagine it until you're there and you get this sense of anything can sort of get lost out here. But also the culture of the Pacific Northwest in general tends to foster a sense of isolation that's in some senses, like you don't often have the same people up in your face all the time. People have this distance between each other in terms of space and in terms of just general interaction. So it gives people opportunities to have a lot of privacy to do things that they want to do. Let's just say, hide the things they want to hide.
That was one of the interesting things for me that I felt when I was in Lewiston and Clarkston. I got this sense that, and I'd always had the sense that like Pacific Northwest, DB Cooper style, is a great place to go if you want to disappear.
Yes.
But what I realized, or if you wanted to hide, but like what I realized is it's an excellent place to go if you want to be around people, but you also want to disappear. And therefore, if you're a serial killer, if you want something to disappear.
People aren't going to peer too closely at you, I mean, you're going to be able to just kind of be among people and they're not going to like overly look.
They won't see you. Like,
yeah. It's so
like,
true.
You can drive 5 miles and be like nowhere.
Yeah.
So one of the things I want to say about these episodes is we're not going to turn this into a murder mystery. So we're not really hiding the ball on the suspect on this one. So
no, we are not.
Yeah. And so, one of the things, starting with Christina's disappearance, it was really shocking to Soton in the region. It was often covered in the local newspaper there, which was called, I cannot even think of its name. It was
Lewiston
called
Tribune?
No. That's not the one I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the Soton one, which was something, I'll figure it out. It was something Flats Gazette. It was a name for a geographic thing. That was the one in Asotin County. And then it was covered in the Lewiston Tribune, which was the area's sort of largest daily newspaper. And there wouldn't be any clues in her case for 4 years until the fall of 1992.
82.
or excuse me, thank you.
Yeah.
There'd be no clues in her case until the fall of 1982, when the sort of unimaginable happened upriver. So on a hill in downtown Lewiston, there are three people: Stephen Parasol, Christina Nelson, and her stepsister Brandy Miller disappeared without a trace from Lewiston. Eventually, detectives determined that they were all likely at the Lewiston Civic Theater at the time of their disappearances. So ultimately, Christina Nelson, or Christy, who's 21, Brandy Miller, her stepsister, was 18, and Stephen, who was 35, were all connected to the theater. Christina was involved sort of backstage, helping out with things. She had previously been the janitor there. Stephen was working as the janitor at the theater. Brandy would often go to events there. So, they were really participating in a part of the performances, whether they were in the audience or they were participating in the background or the foreground. So what we'll find is that the first real clue in Christina White's case actually comes from these disappearances that happen upstream in Lewiston.
Yeah. And that's where it becomes difficult in some ways to quickly sum up the case, because we start with this disappearance of Christina White in 1979. And then it's the series of murders that happens later, and then how we're able to sort of work back. And, Christina's case sort of that linchpin that you can sort of unravel the mystery from there. And normally investigators at the time wouldn't have made this connection between the disappearance of a 12-year-old girl, many miles away, or, miles away, with the disappearances of three people in their 30s. But the disappearances of them all had one thing in common. And the same man whose house Christina was going to visit, he was working at the Lewiston Civic Theater on the night that Brandy, Christy, and Stephen disappeared. He was, at the time of Christina's disappearance, boyfriend of her friend Rose's mother. And her mother's name was Patricia Brennan. And Brennan was the granddaughter of Walter Brennan, the renowned American actor and singer who made a fortune in the real estate industry. And Patricia's boyfriend and the man who was working at the Lewiston Theater was a then 46-year-old man named Ross. This connection would lead investigators to take another look at the 1981 murder of a 22-year-old University of Idaho senior named Kristen Noel David, whose dismembered body was found in the bags off the Red Wolf Bridge on the Snake River across from downtown Clarkston, Washington. Kristen also was known to have worked at the theater, helping with costumes. So this is adding up. As you're seeing, it sounds like we're running from one name into another. And that's one dead woman and four missing people, all tangentially or directly connected to Voss. And thanks to people like Lewiston Detective Don Schofler and Asotin Sheriff's Office Detective Jackie Nichols and Christie's cousin, Gloria Crow-Boberts, there would be even more disappearances and murders that would tie back to Voss. And we're going to be talking about a lot of that. But that didn't mean that there were not other suspects, because this was, again, the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. So there were a lot of people active around time and in this region. And, we're going to root through all of that too. But possible other suspects would include Harry Hantman and Otis Toole, who is the partner in crime to famed Henry Lee Lucas, drifter killer. The killers, they traveled all over the place throughout the area. So they were strong prime suspects at the time. But I am just going to go ahead and kill that spoiler for you. Henry Lee Lucas confessed to literally every murder that ever happened in order to bolster his celebrity. And so nothing he confesses to should really be considered, on its face.
That's so true.
Yeah.
And if it isn't crazy enough already, so we have three people who disappeared from the Civic Theater, and we'll get into, what we find out about that. We've got Christina White, who's disappeared from Asotin. And we now have Kristen Noel David, whose body's found in the water in garbage bags on the at the Red Wolf Crossing Bridge in Clarkston. Years later, Christy's cousin, Gloria Crow-Boberts, uncovered some clues that put Voss as the last person to see Diane Taylor, an 8-year-old who was kidnapped and murdered in 1963 in Chicago. I got to tell you, Gloria is amazing. She is a dogged investigator. She has resilience. So, she told me when she figured out the connection, like not necessarily, she hadn't honed in on him entirely, but knew Diane Taylor was murdered in his neighborhood. She called the Chicago Police Department. I was like, how did you get anyone in the Chicago Police Department? She's like, I just called the first precinct I could find in the phone book, and it was called the first precinct. And so she ended up calling them, and it led to the exhumation of Diane. So
wow.
Lance Voss was 15 at the time. He was working as a camp counselor at the YMCA, where Diane was a day student, and witnesses, 2 boys, would come forward to say that Lance was the last person to see her. I remember having a conversation last year. I was on the Prosecutor's Podcast listeners episode right after I got back from Lewiston, and I was telling Brett, he was like, "What are you doing in Idaho?" In the episode, I was looking into a case, and it was this case. And so I ran by him like, "Here are all the bodies connected to this point," and he was like, there becomes a point where enough disappeared or dead bodies end up near you. Mere presence doesn't work as an excuse anymore. And I think, when you're the last person so far in this story to see 5 missing or murdered people, it really does start to move from that legal concept of mere presence into the neighborhood of some pretty strong circumstantial evidence.
Very much.
So I'm going to go ahead and walk you guys through the timeline. It's the day of the Asotin County Fair, which is a big deal in that community. Then after spending the morning with her mom and sister at a parade downtown, Christina White left her house sometime after 1 p.m. on April 28th, 1979. She was going to go see her classmate and friend, Rose Clarenew, who lived about a 2-minute bicycle ride away. From there, I did the walk. You go down the hill, you take a quick left. It would not be a long trip on a bike. So Rose shared a home at 503 2nd Street with her mother, Patricia Brennan, her 10-year-old brother, Clint, and Patricia's boyfriend, Lance Voss. So Christina was a frequent presence at the house. Lance also stayed at the house, but he also owned a vacant home at 819 3rd Street, which is up the hill, essentially up the hill 1 block, but very close to Christina's house. So you would have had to pass Lance's second house to get to either of those houses. I mean, there were other ways to go, but it would be the fastest way to go. So you've got Rose and her family, including Lance at the time, living at one house, then the empty house on 3rd Street.
And Christina's plan for that day was to, after, they had gone to the parade with her mom and her sister, she was going to go to Rose's house to help Rose get her horse ready for the fair. The horse was normally stabled at a location about 6 miles away, and we'll get back to that in a second. And the question that a lot of people had was, would an adult have been involved at this point in sort of transporting the kids there to prepare the horse? It's hard to say. This is kind of, a lot of people have conflicting memories about this particular moment for a lot of different reasons, and we'll cover as well. There was the parade earlier that day, which the horse would have participated in. So by the time Christina arrived a little after 1 p.m., it seems likely that the horse was probably already back at Rose's house, if anything, and ready to be taken to the fairgrounds for the other events that were going to be happening that day. Either way, the question of whether they're adults at the home is, again, one of the many elements of this case still shrouded in mystery, and as is what transpired over the couple hours that followed her arrival. What most people believe happened is that around what most people believe happened was that around 2:30 p.m., Christina called her mother, Betty Eminger. Betty and her husband, Mick, lived with Christina in the house on the hill on Jefferson Street. And Betty had seen her at the Voss home about an hour and a half earlier. 2:30 p.m., Christina called her mom to say that she wasn't feeling well and she wanted her to come pick her up. Betty, who did not own a car, told Christina to rest, to lie down, and to put a moist towel on her neck. And then when she felt better, to return home. And I also want to say, too, on the documentary, I think it's Confluence, Betty was interviewed for that. And you can find that documentary on Amazon Prime. She stated that Christina was often very sensitive to the heat, and it was pretty warm that day, but she'd been out walking around, going to the fair. You know, even if it's a little warm, you're feel it more, especially when you're around her age at 12 years old, I think. So this was something that didn't really surprise her, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense to me. And it sounds like, you know, this is your average day, and it's hard for me to describe how idyllic and beautiful this town is. Like from up the hill at Christina's house, you can see down the hill into this beautiful town, all the way into the Snake River, which is just unbelievably beautiful. This is Christina, for those of you who are interested in, who are on YouTube and seeing this part live. This was Christina White right around that time. And this is a view from downtown Asotin out into the Snake River. And you can see how vast and wide it is. And it looks like that's a small hill on the other side. It is no small hill. There are many hills like that, and they're enormous. And this is another view from the park in Asotin, and this is another beautiful one from
picture.
Park in Asotin. Yeah, it is just an idyllic, gorgeous town in a gorgeous place. And if you want to sort of like place it in the region, you can see from this map, if you go to the top on the left, you can see there's Clarkston, Washington, that is that sort of like gray area. And then Lewiston, Idaho is right beside it. And if you follow the Snake River south toward the bottom of the map, there's Asotin. So Asotin's a small town, but you know, in the region, there are not a lot of other large places.
It's sort of like a cluster surrounded by, it's a lot like what I wanted to say too, when we were talking about the geography. My husband's from Oregon and he has family there. It's very much the same way. You just have vast, with very few even freeways cutting through, and just like clusters of towns, just here and there with just nothing in between them. So that's just what it strikes me as what this area is that you have this nice populated area, but there's not a whole lot outside of it for many miles.
Is it my turn?
Oh, let's see. I think the blue there, I think, is where you would be mentioning.
Did you go through the towel?
Did I?
I don't think so.
Wait, hold on here. What most people, I talked about the horse.
Oh,
yeah, okay. It's still you, and we're
okay.
now, So.
Okay, yeah, no problem, no worries.
Right.
I didn't remember you talking about the moist towel, so that's part.
Oh yeah, I mentioned that right again, and I kind of improv'd something off the end of it. So
okay,
but the moist towel, and that was the thing. We're gonna have to talk about that whole situation here in a sec.
Was it pink or was it white? We'll see.
Yeah.
So, all right, here we go, Alyssa. You can cut all that crap out. Here we go. So, this is just one of the weirdest parts of the story to me. When I went to Asotin, it took about 7 minutes to walk from the house where Christina lived with Betty, her mom, Google Maps clocks it at 11-minute walk. Some of the other people I know who have been there clock it a little closer to the 11-minute walk. Going downhill, it wasn't that hard, but the hill's a bit of a hike. And in several news accounts, people report that Christina's mom, Betty, said she didn't go get Christina because of a lack of a car. She didn't have a car at the time. But barring something that I don't know that explains it, I had a real hard time understanding what the real reason Betty didn't go down the hill to get Christina was once she knew that Christina was sick. And it made me wonder whether that call ever happened, whether she ever really talked to Christina, but it was confirmed by Clint, one of the children, Rose's younger brother, who was in the house. So it was a bit of a mystery for me what happened there. And I think that's one of the problems in missing persons cases in general. No one's really thinking about every little detail until after the person is gone. And one of the Snake River Killer researchers, Samantha Sawyer, who I think is really amazing, and you're going to hear from her in the next episode, she pointed out to me that the most likely reason Betty wasn't able to pick up Christina may have been because Betty had just put Christina's sister, Carlin, down for a nap. And Betty probably didn't want to wake Carlin or leave a sleeping toddler unattended, because if she had woken Carlin and taken her, she would have had to put her in the stroller or something else and taken her down the hill. And so this makes a lot of sense to me, particularly as Samantha pointed out. Betty would have been going down an incline and then back up an incline with a sick child and a little child.
Right.
So, yeah.
And if she thought that Christina was just a little overheated and just needed to rest a little bit, I mean, I could see as a mom of who's raised a couple kids and remembers when they were about that age and at 12 years old, I think I would have. I could see that. That doesn't sound like something that I would have not done myself. I would have just said, just rest up and, see if you can walk home. If you can't, give me a call. But you just want to give the kid a chance to kind of feel better and whatnot. And it's a small town. And that's the thing. Everybody will tell you this kind of stuff just never happened around here. It's a very safe community. So you have a reason to understand why Betty didn't just get right up and run down there.
Yeah, less worried, right? So we don't really know if any adults were at the house with Clint and Christina. Based on Clint's account, it was only he and Christina that were at the house. There's some other accounts that create some conflicts with that we'll hear, but we're pretty sure that two facts are probably true. Christina was there, Clint was there. Who else may have been there? Harder to tell. So Detective Nichols told me that the missing persons reports during the time weren't as detailed as they are now. And this case was no exception. She said a lot of the interviews to figure out what had happened that day didn't happen for years. So what we have a good idea about is that Christina was going there to see Rose and that they were going to prepare Rose's horse for the fair at Flynn Farm about 6 miles away. And we don't know how Christina got the idea from Rose to do this, but we do know from an account from Rose's brother Clint that he was also there, and that he said, at least later, that Rose was not there. So we don't know whether Patricia Brennan or Lance Voss were there or where they were in the moment.
Yeah, knowing he was there was difficult. And I was also curious as to Rose as well. Was Rose at the house? But there was, I think it was, Clint had said that he'd gone ahead to do something. So basically Christina showed up. Rose wasn't there. She wasn't feeling too good. But it might be helpful to step back and just sort of talk about the general timeline of the fair and see what we can kind of piece together. And according to what Betty and Christina's friends would later say. So the fair, again, it was a huge deal in town. Supposed to start at 10:30 in the morning, a few miles away, on high ground in this canyon community of about 1,000 people. Drew a lot of people from the region, included fair booths, rides, local showings of horses, livestock, 4-H stuff, great fair stuff. Betty would later say that she and her 2 daughters, Christina and Carlin, left the house at 10 a.m. to go to the fair and do the parade. Betty says that she and Carlin were on foot and Christina went ahead on her 10-speed bike. And according to the Snake River podcast, the fair started with the parade at 2nd Street, which was near both Lance Voss's unoccupied house and the street where Voss lived with Patricia, Rose, and Clint. The podcast also said that they had found many accounts that suggest the parade wrapped up around 11:30. And they say Christina, Carlin, and Betty walked down to a park to have lunch. And then after that, Betty and Carlin walked back up to their house, passing 2nd Street, where they were going to meet a family friend who was going to give them a car ride somewhere. So that they're aware, but at this point, Christina splits off from mom and little sis. And
I think it's important. Yeah. And it's, some of it is, I think, Betty did, in the documentaries and other pieces share her version of the stories. What I've kind of picked up, it sounds like she was going at some point to run errands, but also needed Carlin to take a nap. So.
Yeah. And again, we're talking about a very capable 12-year-old girl on a bicycle, pretty independent. And especially again, in 1979, by the time you're 12 years old, you're very independent. As the child of the 80s myself, I was babysitting by the time I was her age. So you have a lot of responsibilities. You're trusted with a lot of things as someone that back in those days. And so again, none of this is really unusual to anybody who grew up in this period, and especially in a small town. But Betty,
and one thing, Allison, that's worth noting is where if they came up Jefferson Street to go back to the house, and Christina turned on to the street that Rose lived on, they would have only been separated for about 2 blocks. So Christina was not going on her own for very long.
Right. Yeah. You're just going down the street. I mean,
down the street.
Even by 2024 standards, that's to me, even by today's standards, totally acceptable. This dynamic, I can just feel the security that this mom feels in this moment. And she, Betty, she did say in the documentary Confluence that when the family friend and Carlin drove down Jefferson Street, she took a left on 2nd and passed Rose's house, and they saw Christina on the porch, and they all waved at each other. And that was the last time Betty saw her daughter. And many people consider Christina and Rose to be best friends. They loved hanging out. They, would walk across the river, do arts and crafts together, horseback riding. People in town did report that Patricia, Rose's mom, had been single, but she had started dating Lance Voss, who had recently moved to town. So at about 2 p.m., Betty says she was at her house on Jefferson Street. Betty said that Carlin had an afternoon nap, and soon after, Christina called to say she was sick. And that's when Betty gave the advice to put the wet towel around her neck, thinking that Christina was suffering from heat exhaustion. Again, she was kind of prone to that. Betty says in Confluence that she told Christina that if she was not better, she should walk to the end of the block on 2nd Street, which would have been right in front of Lance Voss's unoccupied house. Betty said that she could see Christina and walk down the hill to get her and help her back up the hill. There are unconfirmed reports, however, according to a February 22nd, 1980 article in the Lewiston Tribune, that some people thought they saw Christina as late as 10 p.m. on April 28th that day at the carnival. So again, some conflicting reports, and there are even more conflicting information here, as Jayson will tell you.
Yeah, and I mean, we've got a detailed description. Several people, Clint, Betty, others who saw Christina that day, they knew she was wearing a tan and pink striped shirt, blue jeans, red tennis shoes, and a 10-speed white.
And this was a cool bike, by the way. This bike stuck out. Like, this was, again, 1979. If you had a cool bike, you were in, right? And this was a cool bike. It was more like a boy's bike. It was big for her, but she could ride the heck out of it. So she stood out with that bike.
So, for me, in thinking about this, like when I first got to Asotin, because I had heard about a lot of these things, and I got there and I visited, and some things just felt like they didn't make any sense to me. So Betty's house, which I think I do have an image of. Betty's house is set back off the road. And I could not fathom, for me, how you could see down the street, because it's got a really big front yard, how she would have seen Christina. And, she would have had to walk, in my mind, to the end of beyond her driveway to see the corner where Voss's house was. That corner that he's on, she would have seen down there to where Christina was. And so, one really interesting thing that Betty recalls Christina said on the call was that nobody was home.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it meant no adults were home or nobody was home but Clint. And maybe that was a part of, so some of this may have been going into Betty's thinking about, like Sam pointed out, I'll let Carlin sleep a little bit, then I'll head down there, and that she's essentially just asking Christina to meet her halfway.
Yeah.
And that she had planned to go down there for that. So.
And I could see Christina saying nobody was home if, say, the person she was intending to see when she got there was not there. And so in a kid's mind, you're going to make that shorthand, which then tells me, yeah, Rose wasn't there. And it makes me question any account later on that she was. But Clint would later, and that Clint, again, being Rose's brother who was there at the house, would later tell the host of the Snake River Killer podcast, Brandon Schrand, that he remembers getting Christina a damp washcloth and her sitting out on the house porch. There are then conflicting reports about who else was home again. Betty assumed that Christina felt better when she did not return home or call back. But Betty decided to go to the fair to find Christina there. And it was about a 22-minute walk, or about a 9-minute drive, or roughly 2 miles away, and depending on which way she went. And it would have taken her right past where Christina was lying down on the porch if she were in fact there. But Betty did not find Christina at the fair. Classmates there told Betty they last saw her on the way home on her bike. The bike was a new 10-speed, possibly a Schwinn brand, with a basket on the front and a distinctive 3-inch wing nuts on the front wheels. So again, this was like a monster bike, especially for a 12-year-old kid. It was reported by some that the bike had a license plate on it, said Asotin 128. Although others did not recall the plate, there are some that did. Clint later said that the license plate had been a gift from her mother's boyfriend, Lance Voss. That night, Betty called authorities for help finding her missing daughter. The people of the town, many of whom were at the fairgrounds during the day, and the sheriff, they began searching for Christina. We have Betty, Lance, and others were part of this massive search across Asotin, its hills along the Snake River, which again, this river runs more than 300 feet wide in places near Asotin. Christina's father, her biological father, Gary White, who lived 245 miles south in Payette, Idaho, he would also join the search. Oh, and by the way, Gary and Betty divorced back in 1968. So they've been divorced pretty much her entire, Christina's entire life. Also, Betty was a housewife as well as a part-time student, full-time employee at their Regional Recycling Incorporated Center in Lewiston. Gary, at that time, was a car salesman who owned a business operating out of Oregon at the time. So it's a little background on Christina's parents, because I know a lot of people are going to have questions about them. The Lewiston Tribune would later report that searches by plane and ground were made of the area for several days. And they even called in a psychic for the case. And a girl reportedly matching Christina's description was spotted on Bridge Street in nearby Clarkston, Washington. But the sheriff's office in Clarkston investigated and determined it was someone else. So it was as if Christina White had vanished. 12 years old, she was gone. And again, in the roughly 45 years since, she has never been seen.
Yep. And so Betty says in the Confluence documentary that she called friends, acquaintances, and neighbors when Christina didn't return home. She said that she and her husband, Mick, it was Mick Iminger was his name, walked the streets looking for Christina or her bike. They asked the MC at the fairgrounds to make an announcement in the case. Just in case Christina had gone there. Close to midnight, they filed their missing persons report. And Clint told the Snake River Killer podcast that only he was at the house when Christina arrived. He said that Rose had left for trail classes she had for horseback riding that day. So it creates a bit of a mystery why Christina would have gone there, and she would have gone there at that time. Clint told Christina, at least according to Clint, that he thought Rose would be back in about an hour. I listened to the audio of the call or of the interview. He said an hour, or that he wasn't sure when. But after some point, Clint said to Christina, or Christina asked Clint, at least according to Clint, if she could use the phone to call her mom. And so waiting for Rose, in my mind, could sort of explain why Christina was in the front yard when her mom drove by. Clint said that when Christina asked to use the phone, he offered to let her come in the house to get cool. And he describes giving her a washcloth that he dampened with water. I think he said it was a pink washcloth. But his version of events is different than Betty's, because Clint says Christina's mom told her to wait on the front porch of the house and that she would be there in 5 minutes. But Gloria said that she spoke to Clint in 2009, and he said that he wasn't home alone. And she said that Clint told her no one else was inside the house, so technically true that no one else was home, but that Lance Voss was in the backyard bathing his family's dogs. And another interesting thing, too, is that the police department says that Lance told them that he was the one who gave Christina a washcloth.
These guys cannot get their story straight, and I want to remind people that, again, Clint at this time was 10 years old. So his own memories are going to be a little all over the place in some instances, but there's some indication that they could have been influenced in some way as well. That's kind of how I think why have these very wildly differing stories over the years if you're not being fed information.
Right. I mean, and memory is it's a fragile thing.
It is.
It can get twisted. People can recall different things and you can incorporate into your memory, but you always have to worry when, memories sort of point toward different narratives. And the fact that Lance told the police that he was the one who gave Christina the washcloth,
right?
I mean, there's no reason to say that unless Lance was trying to protect someone else. But in either version of events, like there are multiple places where Christina could have come in contact with Lance Voss on the way home, at Rose and Clint's house. It could have been at the corner or in between, at the corner or on the street where Lance's empty house was,
right,
that she would have had to pass. So we're around like 3 p.m. when Christina's mom finally shows up at their house to say, hey, I can't find Christina. And so Detective Nichols, who's interviewed most of the major players in the case, said she's fairly confident that Rose was there at the house, but less sure that Lance Voss was. So that's another interesting twist to the whole story and the conflicting accounts.
Do you feel, having walked this, that it's very likely that if Christina were going to do as her mother reportedly said, go to the end of the block. Would she have passed that empty house then? On the way to doing that?
Easily, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, easily. At least, the corner around the corner from it.
Okay.
At least around the corner from it. So, and if you, this is the street from Christina's house. You can see down the hill. Lance's house is down on one of those corners that we can't see right now. Those were pictures of downtown. This is the fairgrounds where everyone was. This is the house that Clint Rose lived in,
Okay.
zooming in on it there. And you can see, did I not include a picture? I did include. And you can see here the photos here are, that's the front of Lance's empty house, the back of it, which has a new deck on it that didn't exist then. But it's right there on that corner. And
Okay.
I've got a map of the town that I can show. And if you look at it and you look at this map, you can see essentially, well, I should go to the right map. Huh.
We have lots of maps. I remember you seeing that map earlier, though. It might be toward
I,
the end of the stack.
I,
But
I know I've got it here. Oh yeah. So here you can see it at the bottom of this map. You can see that white pin. That's you can see where Christina's house is. And if you follow it straight down the street toward one block, you can see you're 1 block, 2 block. You're at the corner with Third Street, where Lance's house is on that block, that next block. If you go down the Third Street house, the one that Rose and Clint live with, and then just on the end of the other block is the house, the empty house that Lance had. So
okay.
you essentially, they're all clustered like within less than a quarter of a mile of each other. So they're really super, super close. And you had to pass them to get there. And when I looked at this map, I thought this was huge, but these blocks are very, very small as blocks go. A New York City block, maybe like 7 or 8 of these.
Oh, for sure.
So they're very, 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 very small, and it's a relatively short distance that anyone's traveling. So I one thing about all the stories that sort of stands out to me, that has me leaning toward the fact that Rose was in fact home, is one, Christina believed that Rose was home.
Yeah.
She told Betty that, if we're to believe that, and there's no reason not to believe that. But the thing that really sort of weighs on me that Rose was probably there, whether she remembers it or not, is that it was the day of the fair. It doesn't make any sense to me that she would be at horseback riding
That's a good point.
classes on the day of the fair, because where's the teacher going to be? At the fair. And Rose's horse was supposed to be on display at the fair. So maybe Rose is gone, but that story of her being at courses just doesn't ring true to me, which causes me to question everything that Clint says about what
Yeah.
happened.
I would think too, it was the day of the fair. If Rose was anywhere and she wasn't home, she was going to be at or around the fairgrounds. Like,
Yep.
so, I did ask, then like, do we have Rose's account of this? And she hasn't really spoken, much
Publicly. Yeah, she
publicly.
hasn't spoken publicly about it.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the things that's also really sort of like interesting about that entire thing, in the interview that Clint does with the Snake River Killer podcast, he is constantly trying to point toward other people. Like
Yeah.
you can tell he's pointing toward Betty, Christina's mom potentially lying. He's pointing toward her husband. He's pointing in every direction he can. And later in the story, when we get to the Civic Theater part of it, you're going to see Clint is doing the exact same thing. He's pointing to everyone else other than and so it really makes me question his version of the events. And Betty's story has been pretty consistent from Confluence. In 2011, when I went and I looked at newspaper articles in the Tribune from the 1970s, pretty consistent story. Consistent story about what happened that day, consistent story about how she felt afterwards.
Oh, yeah. Betty just seems steady Betty. Honestly, that was the I got from her was believability. She wasn't tripping any of my sensors. I know that's sounds like a trust me bro source, but yeah. But there were no signs, Christina, for until several weeks later. And this part just, okay. So at the farm, at Flynn Farm, where the horse was being stabled, where Rose's horse was stabled, where they were supposed to go that day, according to Christina, they found a stack of her homework papers, Christina's homework papers, along with those of a classmate named Molly. They were found in a horse trough at Flynn Farm, which again was about 3 miles away from where Christina was last seen at the Brennan Voss house, or was it 6? I can't remember, because I know there was a 6 mile, again, a few miles away. And remember, this is where Rose kept her horse, where Christina had purportedly been intending to go with Rose. But it had been unclear if that trip had even happened, remember, due to the timeline of events. The birds were found at the edge of the Flynn property and had been placed neatly on a wood box. They weren't just scattered around or, just tossed anywhere. They were just laid there. And imagine that if they had been there long, the wind could have picked them up, but that didn't happen either. Carl Flynn, one of the owners of the property, said he believed that the notes were placed there close to that date that they were found, because they weren't disturbed, as I said, and he passed by that location multiple times a week. Carl says that the homework papers were found within a week of Christina's disappearance, but some records do suggest that it was later. And so anyway, I just find this so baffling, that because we have no indication that she had a bag, that Christina had a bag with her that would contain homework papers. And I also just wonder, how would anybody get hold of them to plant them there? Anybody who'd want to misdirect investigators or something like that. How would Voss have gotten hold of these papers? Who knows? This is just such a weird little mysterious element here. But 34 days later, in a June 1st article published in the Lewiston Tribune across the river in Idaho, the writer noted that Betty was beginning to discount several possibilities for what happened to her daughter. She told the reporter that she did not believe that Christina had run away, because if she was free to communicate, she would have contacted relatives. She also said that she was doubtful that Christina had been thrown into the Snake River, because bodies that had been in the river less time usually surface and are, could be recovered. Betty and her husband, Mick, told the reporter that they had even followed a traveling Rainier's show carnival that had been nearby to several cities without finding a trace or a clue about Christina in the in the article, Betty told the reporter that after Christina had called, she walked down to an agreed upon meeting site about an hour later, but did not find her daughter. Although later accounts would question that timing, Betty told the reporter that she did not believe Christina, who went to a Lutheran church regularly, had been kidnapped by a religious cult, a rumor that had been spread. Of course, in this part of the country, there are some cults around. Let's be clear, but this doesn't seem very likely.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, go ahead.
There was an active one in the area that they did look into, but no
Oh,
clues,
okay.
just like, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good place for cults to hang out. They can have their little compound and, be happy.
Cults, white supremacists.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Betty noted that Christina had 2 summer camping trips planned and had planned to spend a month with her father. And she was also signed up to try out for baseball. So she was excited about a lot of things. She wouldn't have run away. She had a lot to look forward to. The article also mentions that Christina's father even flew a helicopter at a low level to try to spot an abandoned bicycle. He also offered $1,000 reward, which is about $4,300 in today's money. But they just don't, Betty said, we just don't know what to do next except to keep praying. I just can't imagine what they were going through. All the suggestions in the articles pointed to any and everyone else other than what FBI statistics tell us is true. That when a child disappears for a long period of time and does not end up in an accident, the kidnapper is likely to be someone close to everyone. So someone
Well,
that the child knows,
and
perhaps.
just jumping back to answer your question, the Flynn farm where the homework papers were found was
Mhm.
about 3 miles from the fairgrounds.
Okay. Okay.
And then it was about 5 or a little more than that from where Christina was last seen. And the homework papers are really fascinating to me because
Yeah.
she could have left them somewhere.
Mhm.
But they point to a couple things, right? Did she go home? While her mom was out looking for her, did she somehow end
Oh,
up back at her house? Had they been left at a previous time, somewhere, right, else?
yeah.
Uh, but also, I mean, they point to a couple different things. They point to potentially her family's involvement in the abduction. They point to the Flynn family as
Yes.
potentially having something to do with it. But I think the important thing to put a fine point on about where her homework was found is that it's where Rose kept her horse. What are the
Yes.
odds of that? It was not far physically on the farm from where the barn was, where Rose's horse was.
Yeah.
So it's and Christina had been there with Rose, not in the last week or so. But we know we know another thing too, that another girl's homework was in there too, Christina's friend's homework.
Right.
So just the question of w- how and why that homework would have ended up there, other than whoever is responsible for her disappearance deliberately putting it there either to throw investigators off or point investigators in their direction but not directly. Those are the things inquiring minds want to know.
Indeed. I don't even have, I mean, honestly, I'll be turning that one in my head around for quite a while, trying to
Yeah.
figure it out.
Yeah. Do you want to pick up or
Do
yeah?
you, okay, because
Want me
I
to
think,
pick up?
and that's, I do want to say too, as we talk about, you know, the kids and, a lot of kids back in those days, they hung out together constantly. Usually you're kicked out of the house in the morning, you're outside all day, you're playing with your friends, you're with your friends at school, and all this. So I do wonder too with the homework, if there might have been an instance of could Rose have had some of uh Christina's old homework papers in her things. If we're looking to tie Voss to this, that's just a possibility. If maybe Rose had them in her backpack or something. Maybe they did homework together. Or they were in classes together, so maybe they had some of each other's papers. I mean that can happen, with among school kids. So I wonder if there might have been something there, but it's just interesting to consider a lot of the different angles here. So. But yeah, I'd say you can, down to the investigation part where you are.
Do you want me? Because I'm at the 34
Okay.
days. That's where my cursor is. Where'd you drop off?
I am down past the commentary and raising children, letting them roam.
Okay.
So where it says investigation, there where
Okay.
you are. Yeah.
You want me to pick that up? Okay,
Yeah, that
cool.
will be good.
All right. So with what we now know about behavioral science and criminology, one of the really interesting things and one of the cool things we actually found as we were looking into this, a profile that was
Mhm.
built. People think, they're not sure. It's on yellow notebook paper, typed out. They're not sure if it's an FBI profile, but it's a profile of the suspect.
Interesting.
But one of the things that Detective Nichols says, that if she had been on that case on the first day with what modern law enforcement knows about criminals and abductions, in part because people want to look everywhere other than close to home. They want to look at that during that time at like cults, what we didn't necessarily always call serial killers then, but serial killers. They didn't want to look in their neighborhood. They didn't want to look in parents' homes. But she says that she would have been able to get a search warrant in the first day for
Yeah.
that empty house. Unfortunately, it's not something you can all of a sudden do now, because there's this legal principle that if you don't act on probable cause, it becomes spoiled, and you can no longer use that probable cause without
Oh,
discovering some new piece of information.
I see.
Um, so, the evidence is kind of pointing in a couple directions. It's pointing toward Christina's home in reality, and also pointing toward uh, the Voss family connection. And, the evidence pointing in the direction of Voss are reports that he was both at home where he lived with Patricia, Rose, and Clint, and at the fair during the day when Christina went missing. And he even he told people that he was a part of the search. He told Betty and he told others that he was, he paints this picture of himself riding on horseback looking for Christina. um you know the focus of the initial investigation is finding Christina, but the investigators were focused on, like I said, everything else. Let's look into the carnival workers. But eventually they started to focus a little closer to home, and people started focusing, I mean, and to the extent that Christina's family, her father and her mother, actually traveled across the state following the carnival to see if she had snuck into the bottom of some kind of carnival thing. But eventually the investigation starts to focus a little closer to home.
It's interesting too, the whole carnival worker angle. It points to, and to your point about investigators, or people rather, in the town, like looking outside, looking at an outsider. It had to be an outsider that did this. This couldn't have been one of us or one of ours. I think that's like the first instinct of a lot of people, is that who came into our town and took our kid, or hurt one of our people. This reminds me a little bit too, when you and I covered the Catherine and Sheila Lyon case, and Lloyd Lee Welch, who himself was a carnival worker, and allowed him to sort of drift and avoid detection in a lot of the crimes that he did at the time, at least a lot of the petty crimes that he was up to at that time. It's interesting though, because carnival workers, while we have the cultural stereotype of the carny and the sort of the drifter hobo type that kind of just prowls the streets and looks for trouble, that tends to be, again, the stereotype. They're often not as likely a suspect in these things as you might think, mostly because they're working long hours in very unfamiliar areas, and so certain crimes aren't going to be as likely. There may be crimes, just not maybe a crime like this. While drifters are absolutely a thing, their crimes tend to look a little different from this. They're not going to know whether they're in a heavily trafficked area for either kidnapping or dumping bodies. So I personally feel that if it had been a person unfamiliar with the area, we might have been more likely to find Christina at the end of all of this. You know what I mean? I think
That's a good point.
it would take somebody familiar, I think, with the area to make her
Mhm,
disappear.
and even the ebbs and flow of the fair itself, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
so law enforcement eventually rules out carnival workers, but not without law enforcement themselves also following them state to state, searching for clues.
Yeah, they went down that rabbit hole. They did, because I mean there's always a good reason to look at unfamiliar elements in the area and see if there's anything to do with that. But in February of 1980, Christina's family asked the Stoughton County Sheriff's Office to use the services of a nationally known psychic. Stoughton Mayor Ari Olson backed the idea of bringing in Dorothy Allison, not to be confused with this Allison, a psychic based out of Nutley, New Jersey. She had been in the news that year for, according to an Associated Press article published in the Journal and Courier of Lafayette, Indiana, she had led police in New York, New Jersey to find the body of a 16-year-old teenage boy through a vision that she had. 2 years earlier, she supposedly helped the New York Police Department find the body of a 14-year-old teenage girl on Staten Island using a similar method. In that case, the girl's body was found in a 55-gallon oil drum at the bottom of a 12-foot shaft that fit the psychic's description. So Dorothy said she would refuse to take money from families looking for their missing children, but she also refused to work on cases without approval from law enforcement agencies. She sounds like a real business-minded kind of psychic. As far as, whatever you think about psychics goes, she certainly took the job very seriously. The Stoughton County commissioners publicly pressured Sheriff Herbert Reeves to use the even though as manager said for her travel to Stoughton County. What Mick may or may not have known at the time, though, is that he himself was a prime suspect in this. As investigators began to look a little closer to home, because obviously you're going to look at, family as well. Eventually, Sheriff Reeves did cave and brought Dorothy Allison in to Stoughton in March of 1980 and July of 1980 to look into Christina's disappearance and also that of a woman missing in Lewiston in 1976. She would report that she got the feel of the area where Christina disappeared, but she apparently picked up no other vibes. She said she kept seeing doubles of things. The name Williams kept popping up, and she saw people that could have been dressed as searchers. The name Williams led to another search of the Snake River Beach and campground named after Edward Williams, a Nez Perce County, Idaho legislator. On the anniversary of Christina's disappearance, Betty and Mick both declined to attend the fair and instead visited relatives in Nez Perce County, while Gary, Christina's biological father, he did not go as well and instead went mining in the mountains near Pence, Idaho. Mick told a reporter from the Lewiston Tribune a few days before the fair, "I hope all parents remember to keep their eyes on their children." And the next year, on July 21st, 1981, in Stoughton, Lance Voss married Patricia Brennan, becoming Clint and Rose's stepfather. In October of that year, Voss lost an election to the Stoughton County Council, and the entire family then moved that month from Stoughton to Clarkston, Washington. And during this time period, Voss begins posting curious classified advertisements in the local newspaper, including an apparent reference to Christina White's birthday. And here's where things really start to get wild.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Christina's name didn't make the news much again until a bombshell news conference that happened in May of 1984. In that news conference, Lewiston Police Chief Rodney Fredrickson said law enforcement had developed a, quote, strong suspect in the disappearance of 2 women in Lewiston. But in that article, he made allusions to Christina and others. So on July 26, 1981, so 2 years after Christina disappears, Kristen Noel David, a 22-year-old senior at the University of Idaho, left for a 32-mile bicycle ride south to Clarkston, Washington from Moscow, Washington, where she had been attending school. Kristen was known to be thoughtful, free-spirited, interested in a wide variety of things, from art to politics. She had previously worked at a Circle K grocery store in Clarkston at the time when Lance Voss worked as a delivery driver for Frito-Lay companies. Voss also, as a part of that job, frequently took trips to Moscow. Oh gosh, I can't. The Kroburger people are going to kill me.
I know.
Frequently took trips to Moscow, where David also worked at the Scorpion Bar, which David's sister said would later say Lance Voss also visited. There's another reported connection between Voss and David. Kristen was said to have worked sewing costumes at the Lewiston Civic Theater, where Voss performed as an actor and would later become the janitor. Kristen headed south on Idaho 95, but never made it to Clarkston. We're about to hit the Koberger map again in a second. Early in the investigation, multiple individuals traveling on Highway 95, the one that Koberger took south, by the way, on the day of David's disappearance, reported seeing a female cyclist matching her description being approached by a man driving a brown van on the west side or southbound side of the highway, just outside of Gianese, Idaho, where Brian Koberger also took a left on the night of the murders in turn. So additional reports suggested that the same man they saw then also spoke with or approached different female cyclists or pedestrians along Highway 95 that same day. The location's about 17.4 miles north of Lewiston and about 15 miles south of where Kristen was in Moscow, Idaho. So on July 4th, 1981, so we're in late June when Kristen disappears. On July 4th, 1981, Kristen's dismembered remains in black plastic bags began to be discovered by fishermen in and along the right bank of the Snake River. And so the Snake River heads east at that point. So the right bank is the northern part of it. And among other places, just off the Red Wolf Crossing Bridge, which connects or which runs across Clarkston in, toward Idaho, even though right where it crosses, it's still Clarkston technically. So some, but not all of her remains were recovered the next day in the river. Some of her body parts were wrapped in various April 1981 editions of the Lewiston Morning Tribune. So we're in July. Her body parts are found in plastic bags, but they're wrapped in different editions of April 1981 copies of the Lewiston Morning Tribune. In total, 5 bags were found. The newspapers certainly pointed to somebody who was in or frequented or was near the Lewiston area sometime between April and July of that year. Others would later report that a man was seen throwing trash bags off the north side of the bridge, which is located about 1 mile from the unusually circular domed house that Lance Voss owned, about a mile to the south.
You don't say.
No, and so it's about half a mile from Christina's reported destination also, the Dome House. And so one interesting thing that was police holdback evidence for a long period of time, but eventually some of the autopsy details slipped out, was in Kristen's skull, according to a autopsy report in August of that year, were metallic fragments that indicated that she had been shot in the head. And in a letter to the county coroner, a pathologist wrote that he thought she had died of a single gunshot wound to the head that was delivered from the front at a downward angle, shattering her facial bones. There were no defensive wounds on her hands, and the only injuries appeared to be 2 bruises on her upper left buttocks. The pathologist reported that they found little blood in her body and almost no internal organs. and that Kristen was dismembered quite skillfully at the joints, with only a couple of areas where they saw bone damage. Sperm was not detected in the vaginal washing and swabs. Toxicology reports were inconclusive, but they did find she had a little alcohol in her blood. And I personally discovered one truly interesting fact in the autopsy report for Kristen. The pathologists say he was convinced that she was shot with a bullet that was 2 millimeters in diameter.
2 millimeters.
Yeah, not 22 millimeters, 2 millimeters in diameter. And that would be like an exceedingly rare caliber weapon. A bullet is described based on its diameter, the circular width at its widest point. And then there is a 2 millimeter, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but I'll go phonetically, but colibri was the smallest commercially available centerfire cartridge, and it was patented in 1910, introduced in 1914 by an Austrian watchmaker, and designed to accompany the colibri semi-automatic pistol or single shot gun. So it has a gun with only one bullet in it, and it was marketed as a self-defense weapon. Colibri comes from the German word for hummingbird. The round was totally not well accepted. The gun's small size made sort of like handling and loading individual cartridges really difficult. So the gun, by the time we're at Kristen David's murder, is more of a collector's item with only about 1,000 ever produced. Wow. So that's a heck of a clue. As would become a bit of a theme in these cases, Kristen's case was tossed from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, including multiple counties and the FBI. A psychological profile of the killer was developed that suggested that it was more likely than not to be a white male in his 20s or early 30s who would have marks or bruises from the attack, drove a brown van, and potentially had souvenirs from the murder. Just like Christina, Kristen's 10-speed bike was nowhere to be found, although they did find the handlebars eventually. Her clothing, identification, and shoes were never found. So what we're going to find is it's very similar to the Diane Taylor story, but we'll get to that soon enough. Some of Kristen's jewelry was recovered.
Yeah, I find it so interesting about the bicycles. The Snake River Killer podcast points out that Voss had a thing for bikes and motorcycles. He was a bit of also a gearhead. And as we'll find as we go through this case, and it starts to become a little more apparent that he seems motivated by the idea of trophies and stuff. It's almost like a, signature. And so it's interesting that these bicycles just don't turn up. And it is interesting though, that there's only the handlebars that were recovered from Kristen David's bike.
And as we walk through these cases, we're going to find out a lot of IDs disappear.
Yeah. And remember too, oh geez, I had a thought in my head that just vanished. That happens. But there were, I saw this in one of the documentaries. I know we didn't make mention of it here in the outline, and I think it's because it ultimately was because the documentary Cold Valley brings it up. I'll mention it here. Wasn't there a witness that claimed to have seen somebody that had been like a woman and a man on the side of the road, and like somebody had been hit by the bicycle, and there was somebody had been hit on the side of the road that had a bicycle, and they saw somebody with the van, but that person was under forensic analysis when they delivered that statement. Right.
Well, but there are several people who saw a man in a van approaching an assortment of people there.
Gotcha.
But the reason why that one sticks out is the idea that the handlebars could have been damaged in it. So that's why they point to that one, that it could be separated. But I tend to not put a lot of weight on that, because someone dismembered her skillfully.
Yes.
They can cut apart a bike.
Absolutely. Right? And I mean, automatically I'm thinking when they say skillful dismemberment, that's somebody who's very practiced at it.
It's
not their first rodeo.
Right. It simply means you're not hitting bones along the way.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. I
you're
mean, like
not.
a good butcher, you know.
Yep, yep, yep. And
Um,
so one of the real problems I think in her case is that, you're on the edge of the Idaho border. You're on the edge of the Washington border.
mhm.
You have like four counties that are coming together in that area. And I think that, and then she's from Moscow, disappears in another county in between, or is last seen. You've got a Native American reservation right beside there, and
Yeah.
Oregon is not too far on 129, the route on the edge of the Red Wolf Crossing Bridge. So you've got a lot of different things, but one of the things that sort of sticks out to me about this is this ad that Voss placed in the newspaper.
Oh,
A
geez.
very curious ad about a German Shepherd being found on an address in Snake River Avenue. Uh, and it was about 1 year after blonde, blue eyed German David's body was found.
Right.
It
And
wasn't German ancestry.
this is part of the pattern, by the way, establishing a pattern here by mentioning these classified ads. He liked to do that
Yeah.
sort of thing. Yeah.
So the next sort of step in this is on the evening of September 4th, 1982. So a year after Kristen David disappears, 35-year-old Stephen Purcell, a janitor at the Lewiston Civic Theater, began working at 6:30 p.m. His girlfriend Carol picked him up around 9 p.m. for them to go to a party. Around midnight, Carol later reported that she dropped Stephen off so he could go do some laundry at the theater and he could practice his clarinet. He didn't have a laundry machine at home. So Stephen was last seen by a police officer who happened to be in the area that night, entering the theater from a side door on 8th Street, which I have a picture of here. It's so the top right side, that's off of 6th Avenue. That's the into the side of the Lewiston Civic Theater, which the front door is the bottom side, and the back will become relevant momentarily. So the police officer sees Stephen enter on the same evening at about 9:15 p.m. So before the midnight drop off, at about 9:15, two stepsisters began to make their way to a local Safeway grocery store. Christina or Christy Nelson, uh, who was 21, and Brandy Miller, who was 18, were last seen leaving Nelson's apartment to go to the store. They had started at Brandy's apartment, or Brandy had started at her apartment before they went to Nelson's nearby apartment, and they left a note for Christy's boyfriend saying where they were going. So both of the stepsisters knew Stephen Parasol, who at this time would still be at the party and not have returned to the theater. And all of their apartments are really, really close to each other and close to the theater. So Gloria Kroboberts, Christy's cousin, says that her family members said that Christy and Brandy saw Stephen as a big brother. Christy had previously worked as a janitor at the theater. Stephen was currently doing it. When she quit, Stephen replaced her. So that night, Christy and Brandy never returned home, nor did Stephen. So his clothes were never found, the ones that he went to do laundry. His clarinet was found in the main theater, but the case was never found.
Which is
So,
so weird.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think an important thing to think about is the timeline here. At 9:15, the girls leave to go to a Safeway, which is like, less than a 10-minute walk away.
Yeah.
They don't return. But then at midnight, Stephen goes to the theater and he doesn't return either. And so at first, law enforcement wondered whether Stephen may have been somehow responsible for the disappearances. Having three people in the town really close to each other disappear at the same time is a bit odd. But some clues came together over the years, including the fact that Stephen hadn't been heard from. He hadn't tapped into any of his resources. He left his car at a friend's house. He didn't pick up his final paycheck. All these things sort of suggest that Stephen is dead.
Mhm.
And eventually on March 19, and here's a key part of 1984 and a tragic part, the remains of Christy Nelson and Brandy Miller were found by a 14-year-old boy who was chasing his hat. It had blown off of his head in a rural area about 35 miles east of Lewiston near Kendrick, Idaho. And the investigators were unable to determine the cause of death for Christy, but they were able to determine that Miller had been murdered. She had been strangled. And investigators initially suspected Stephen, but later stated that all three had probably been in the theater that night at the time that they disappeared. And the clue that really pulled it together, which I'll go ahead and say now, is that cords were found wrapped around Christy and Brandy's body. They had been restrained by cords, and those cords came from the theater.
Wow.
So now that we know they were in the theater, they went to Safeway, somehow they made it to the theater. And if you believe that Stephen Parasol had nothing to do with it, the picture that starts to emerge in your head is that the girls leave with no intention of going to the theater, somehow end up at the theater that night. And
would they have walked past the theater on the way to the store?
You could, but probably not.
Okay.
It would have been a little bit out of the way, enough out of the way. But what you would have, well, we'll get to what you would have walked by, but probably not directly by the theater. There are two ways they could have gone.
Okay.
This would have, the other way that didn't pass the theater would involve much less climbing uphill. And they were known to go through this park that would have gotten them there. But one of the really interesting things to me about the timeline is that if they leave at 9:15 for roughly a 15-minute walk to a Safeway, and somehow they end up at the theater, right? The theater that Stephen left at 6 p.m. to go to a party with his girlfriend. So Stephen's not at the theater. Let's say they go to Safeway, takes them 15 minutes to get down there. They spend 15 minutes in Safeway, 15 minutes there. You're somewhere in between 10 and 11 p.m.
Yeah.
And Stephen is definitely not back yet at the point where they disappear. Now, they could have been hanging out. They could have been doing whatever. But that window, he's not there. But at some point, they end up in the theater. And then unexpectedly at midnight, Stephen shows up. Okay. And that part of the timeline, if you believe that Stephen wasn't involved and he was also killed, suggests that he walked in on them while they were being abducted. Christy and Brandy were not dismembered like Chris and David. The police now believe that the killer kidnapped Brandy and Christy, or either directly kidnapped them or convinced them to go to the theater for some reason, somewhere between Safeway and the theater. And so a way to describe it is the theater is on a big hill in Lewiston, and you go down the road on that hill, and you've got a corner with something called the Red Baron Pizzeria. And if you take a right before, you'd run right into the Safeway. Okay. And so, some of their clothing was missing. Once again, identification was missing. Christy's coat and jewelry, including an opal ring, were found on the scene. So again, jewelry is still there. Identification is missing. Some clothing is missing. 2 coin purses were found, but not their main wallets or purses.
Interesting.
So underwear and shoes of both women were missing. And that could have been predation. Having been to this hill, what it really felt like in looking at the map of the old road is that someone drove their car to the guardrail, tossed the bodies off the side, and it has a very, very high sloped angle. So where it goes, you cannot get to that space easily. So someone really just tossed the bodies over the side there. Gloria and I went out there with her dog Cash, and you can't climb up from the bottom of that hill to where the tree is without serious help. So, it was with all the trees and the hill, it was an excellent place to at least in my mind, to toss a body.
Yeah.
Um, so back on the night of September 14th, 1982, we know some of Lance Voss's timeline because 3 days after the disappearances, he walked into a local police officer or office and volunteered a statement.
Which is so interesting. Well, he kind of needed to in a way, because and we'll explain that in a second. So Voss told the police that he'd been watching the movie The Fog at the Red Baron Pizza Parlor, which was down the hill from the theater and right across from the Safeway grocery store, as Jayson explained a moment ago. He told police that the movie ended at 11 p.m., although local TV guides said it ended at midnight.
Can I pause here for a sec?
Yeah.
So just to say, we have Nelson and Miller go missing somewhere after 9:15 p.m. We have Voss saying that he watched a movie at the pizzeria that's between Nelson's apartment and the Safeway,
Yeah.
and that it ended at 11 p.m., even though the local TV guides say that it ended at midnight, which I think is a bit of a like red herring rabbit hole that people go down to, because if he's saying the movie ended at 11 p.m. and he stopped watching it,
Yeah.
that still puts him in the jackpot time between where the girls go missing and Stephen walks into the theater. What 11 p.m. really does for him is he's not at the theater. Excuse me. What 11 p.m. really does for him is he's not near the time if the girls left at 9:15 when they would have gone missing.
Right.
So, we don't know whether he watched the movies. We don't have witnesses to say that he stayed through the TV guide. But what we do know is that if you believe he watched the movie until 11 p.m., there's a very low likelihood he would have run into Christy and Brandy.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. And that fudging of the time just kind of seems convenient. I mean, he was there. He was at the building right between it. I can just almost imagine if he was sort of hanging out around there, maybe outside, if he smoked or anything like that. Maybe he was outside having a cigarette. The girls are walking by. I mean.
And remember also, part of what he says next is that at 11 p.m., he leaves and he goes to the he goes back to the theater and he falls asleep.
Mm-hmm.
He says that he's working on the rafters and he hurt his back. He was in pain and he fell asleep on the couch. So the beauty of 11 p.m. is it's not near where Christy and Brandy would have disappeared on a short trip to Safeway. And It also puts him asleep when Stephen Parasol works. So 11 p.m. is just perfect. And a lot of people have spent a lot of time in this case focusing on the movie really ending at midnight. But I tend to think like it's a bit like Israel Keys. You can sit around and you can wonder whether Israel Keys is telling the truth about this or that. Like, stop. Just stop.
Yeah.
Just assume it's a lie. And what does the lie serve? The lie, 11 p.m. is perfect. It is the perfect time to not run into either of these parties and enough time to end up asleep.
And he had a time over 3 days to figure that out before he goes in to give his statement. It's like he was getting that timeline for himself worked out. And as we'll see here, because it gets even kind of dumber as we go along from him. But anyway, he said he returned to the theater after the movie and moved his car from the front of the theater to the back. And if you're on YouTube right now, you can see pictures of where he parked his car behind the building. And there's a small loading dock back there there that led to a room where costumes were kept, and he intended to get some tools out of there. Voss said he was planning to work on some rigging, and he had twisted and strained his back during that process. He mentioned physical injuries, cuts and bruises from the accident. So apparently he was kind of beat up a little bit by whatever happened, according to him anyway. When asked, Voss said he did not notice Stephen come into the theater at midnight. If the movie had ended when the TV guide said it did, it would make sense that Voss would not hear Stephen return, but it would, but not if it ended at 11 p.m. At some point, Voss said he heard the phone ringing, but did not pick it up. He told police that he decided to lie down and fell asleep until 5 a.m. and woke up in the green room of the theater and noticed nothing unusual. Voss said he left for home, but realized that his wife, Patricia, had to go to work soon, and he did not want to wake her, so he went back to the theater. This is all very strange, because you have to wonder, what is Patricia thinking at this point? Because he hasn't been home all night, you know?
If you were to believe that, what happened that night is 3 people disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
Voss went back to the theater, injured himself. I mean, his timing was perfect. Injured himself. Wait, hold on. Moved his car from the front of the theater to the back of the theater, which is that picture on the left where you can see those back doors that lead to the
where there is
level.
a loading dock.
Yes. And so, and for reasons unknown, moves his car to the back of the theater, and someone gets into the theater and kidnaps Stephen Parasol. Someone had you also have to believe that someone also either stole those cords from the theater and used them somewhere else to tie up the girls, or had the girls in there and came in and broke in and tied them up. So you got to believe a lot of wild things to think that Voss noticed nothing.
Do you think his claimed injuries happened during the commission of the murders?
Could have been.
I mean, I just feel like he threw his back out. He had some cuts and bruises on him. I mean,
that's exactly what I was thinking. It could be a great excuse for that. You got to believe a lot of strange things for that to happen.
Yeah.
And, one of the other things, Voss at the time had a relatively small car, which points away from him taking 3 bodies away and dumping them. But that part of the story always has bothered me about him saying that he said he heard a phone ring, but he didn't pick it up, slept till 5 a.m., woke up in the green room of the theater, noticed nothing unusual. But then he goes home, he says at 5 a.m., and then he returns. And it really makes me wonder that if I had a small car with not enough room for 3 bodies, maybe what really happened is far before 5 a.m., I drove and I dumped either 1 or 2 of the bodies. And then I returned, and at 5 a.m., I went by my house or something along those lines. Or I went back to the theater. I need an explanation returning to the theater where I pick up the last body and then dump it. And one great thing Brandon points out in the podcast that I think is just really in the Snake River podcast, at that time, or I don't know if Brandon points this out in the podcast. I think he does, or it was either on the podcast or in his blog. It's not like today where you can take your credit card and go to a gas station and get gas in the middle of the night. So also another thing is that 35-mile trip to Kendrick and 35 miles back, whoever it was may have needed to get gas before completing all of their work.
It is mind-blowing to me that he was not investigated further with this, given where he was in the circumstances. How was he not zeroed in on? And I this just blows my mind. I mean, the circumstances here are just overwhelming to me. Like, this is the guy they should be zeroing in on here. Instead, people were treating Stephen Pearsall, who was by all accounts a very gentle and kind and, very good person, did not have the temperament that anybody would ever just suspect. I mean, people just couldn't believe that they would even think him a suspect in this thing.
Well, I
but-
see that's what made Stephen a suspect was in retrospect, Stephen, when they visited his apartment, they said that there were some what they quote unquote deviant things there. Sexually deviant things. Not sure what they mean by that. I've never gotten the details on that. But what people have told me who are close to the case is Stephen was probably asexual.
Yeah.
And so his lack of sort of like sexual interest in people and possibly lack of having sex with his girlfriend made people think that he was some kind of sexual deviant, the investigators at the time. And so that's what put a focus on him. In our lens of better understanding people now, I don't think we would have had that same immediate focus on him.
That's a good point. So strange continue to occur here. Within the next year, they found a men's watch dangling from the rafters above the theater room, but Stephen's family was unable to confirm whether it was his. Around the same time, Christie's wallet was found beneath a Frito-Lay vending machine in an academic building at Lewis Clark College, in a building where Stephen Pearsall had attended classes. Here we go again. I know we're thinking about Stephen Pearsall attending classes there, but I'm just thinking Frito-Lay. Although Snake River Podcast was like having trouble verifying a lot of those employment records, but again, at this time in the 70s, paper records, yada yada. I used to work for Frito-Lay. It's actually pretty high tech now. But anyway, 3 days after Christy and Brandy were found, Voss was brought back in for an interview about the night that they had disappeared. Over the coming weeks, he was interviewed several times, but he refused to take a polygraph. At this point, the police inform him that he is now being interviewed as a suspect. So he was being looked at closely now at this point. They just weren't able to pin it on him. In May, Chief Fredrickson confirmed there was a suspect in the disappearances and deaths at the theater and says that he is being looked at for homicide in another jurisdiction. Voss continued, however, to live a relatively normal life. He continued to volunteer at the theater and work a wide variety of jobs, none of which he seemed to be able to easily hold down. He was a former member of the United States Navy, and he has a pretty lackluster record. Let's just get that out of the way. So it kind of fits a pattern that, Voss just sort of jack of all trades, master of none, doesn't really want to focus or kind of pin down on any one thing. But he was elected as a trustee around this time for the local Veterans of Foreign Wars organization, which is just funny because the man was very nearly dishonorably discharged. It's kind of amazing he wasn't. But anyway, we'll talk more about his Navy life later. He becomes a little more active in politics as well, frequently writing letters and continuing to publish weird little classified ads. So on Christina White's birthday, Voss published an ad in the Lewiston Morning Herald that said, quote, "Lost, March 3rd in the Osoton area, brown husky, phone number 758-9422, and then another phone number, 243-4284. And then comma, eves and weekend. So he provided 2 phone numbers, another missing dog ad. It would have been Christina White's 20th birthday.
Can I pause for a second?
Yeah.
Who has evening and weekend phone numbers? We know that the first phone number is his home phone number. Can't figure out who the second number is, but like without having a weekend phone, who has eves and weekends? But go on.
That is it. Right. Exactly. It would have been Christina White's 20th birthday. In addition, the letters for Christina can be found consecutively in the ad. The letter name Christina. It is a 9-letter name with its letters consecutive in an ad that only has 11 words. The syntax in the ad is so strange, especially for the way classified ads were written. And I also found this very interesting because I did have a job writing classified ads back in the day, and they do follow a particular format. So I wondered like how it got past the editorial
Well, I can tell you on
stage.
my end that if somebody fights you to death on a classified ad,
That's true.
you're gonna get it in whatever way they want. You're just
People,
not gonna recommend. You're gonna tell them like you're wasting your money or.
I actually do remember having a few of those conversations. Good
Yep.
point.
Yep.
The but there aren't many brown huskies. Anybody who's ever seen a dog, they're kind of usually gray, black, and white, a little mottled. Maybe you'll have one with spots of brown, but that's not typical. The first number can't be linked to Voss, but the second phone number can be. Furthermore, if you unscramble the numbers after removing Christina, you can come up with 7 years now. Voss's first and last name can also be found in the ad, but not consecutively. It was 7 years from Christina White's death or disappearance.
What a coincidence.
It is wild. And you can see a lot of these ads too, and I mean, also, if you want to see a huge treasure trove of pictures, and I'll have a link to this too, go to the snakeriverpodcast.com site. Strand and them have put on a great bunch of and evidence there. So, but yeah, the classified ads just really, again, we've talked about this offline, about like how, this is a taunt. This evokes things like Zodiac and, BTK and
sort of like there's an alternative version of this, right? Which is this, that one, Lance Voss committed these crimes and is sticking it in everyone's face through classified ads. Or the other version of it is Lance Voss did not commit these crimes and is still sticking it in everybody's faces. So it could be both, but
he's messing with people. Yeah.
But then I keep thinking about how many people in my life, I was the last person to talk to them before they disappeared.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's all about zero.
Mm-hmm.
And
same.
Yeah. And I'm older than Voss was at that time. So, and I think I hung out probably as a kid with a lot of drug dealers and a lot of criminals. So you would think I would be, but yeah, no.
Yeah, and this keeps happening to him. I was watching earlier a YouTube video from That Chapter channel on this. He did a brief little video on it, and he said this guy is like the Forrest Gump of murder. That he's just always there at the moment that something like this happens, and it's just. But this particular case for me just feels like, yeah, he was a strong suspect, and yet he just managed to slip out of their hands because he wouldn't take the polygraph, and then he shut down and refused to answer questions. And I guess they just didn't feel they had enough to hold him on. Yep. I don't know.
And he was slick. Like he was being investigated in the Spokane serial killings. Yeah. And, he agreed to give his DNA in that case, but it could only be used on those cases, none of the other cases.
Interesting.
But, so it takes us to July 27th, 1987.
Yes. We have another tragedy. And this time from 24-year-old Claudette Voliva.
It's Viola. It's spelled wrong in there.
Oh, so. Viola. Okay, gotcha. A registered nurse and a girlfriend of Lance Voss, who was still married to Patricia, by the way. She was found dead in her apartment. Her death was ruled suicide by overdose, according to a copy of the medical examiner's report. She met Voss at the Lewiston Civic Theater, a production of Footlight Frenzy. Voss arranged her funeral services, and she was buried in the local Normal Hill cemetery. So yet another dead
body showing up around this guy.
Yeah.
So I'm going to dive a little bit into Lance's background. So these are not the first time Lance Voss has been in the close proximity to or a suspect in a murder investigation. Lance was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1947. The family, after his father, Frank, died, they moved to an apartment on Linder Avenue in Chicago. It's about 12 miles west of the Loop downtown. In 1962, he started attending Austin High School in the Austin neighborhood of Chicago. And he was involved in like music, enjoyed spending time in the library, two things that really stayed consistent over his life. Voss was also involved at the local YMCA in the Austin district, where he worked as a counselor. So he's about 15 at this time. And this would be the first time that we know of that he was caught up in a murder investigation. On August 1, eight-year-old Diane Taylor had been attending a day camp at the YMCA and asked Lance to unwrap a lollipop for her, according to two witnesses to the incident. He refused, and the witnesses said Diane kicked him in the shin. Diane was last seen around 2:10 p.m. in an alley behind the YMCA building, just after the shin-kicking incident. Diane's mother returned home around 6:30 p.m. Diane was not home. She reported her around 9 p.m., 9:30 p.m. to the Chicago Police Department. 2 days later, Diane's naked body was found in an alley on Lockwood Avenue in Austin Heights. So there were houses on both sides of the alley. These are really long, wide alleys that ran between the houses, and she was found in the grass behind a fence to one of the yards. She had been stabbed, had head trauma, was sexually assaulted. Stab wound to the heart was believed to be the fatal blow. Some investigators believe that an axe and a knife had been used. Her blouse had been shoved down her throat. This location happens to be between the house where Lance grew up and where he worked as a counselor. The blue shorts Diane was believed to have been wearing were missing, as well as her blue wallet and her YMCA ID.
Yet another missing ID.
I know.
Interesting.
I have a feeling this case is going to be solved by somebody finding a box of IDs.
Yeah.
So the alley had been searched before, so detectives believed that the location she was found in was a disposal site and that it had been dumped on the previous day. So Voss lived about 3/4 of a mile north and to the west of the dump site, virtually between the YMCA building and his home is the site. So in a newspaper clipping, and I'll show you guys the newspaper clipping.
Oh, this is interesting. Yeah.
So
there it is. Oh.
Yeah, here's the coverage of Diane. And in this newspaper clipping, classmates and others from the time have identified that person at the far right as being Lance Voss.
Yeah, his elbow sticking out there.
Yep, this picture was believed to be taken less than 30 minutes after the body was found.
Mm-hmm. And he was there.
Yeah.
Check it out.
Yep. So, Voss was among 700 young men who were interviewed as suspects in the disappearance and murder of Diane by 1963. So the Chicago Police Department would later say that he was among 3 who were serious suspects. In 64, before graduating, Voss stopped attending Austin High School. In 65, so he never graduated from high school.
He flunked out. Now, Snake River points out, right? That
no, I don't think we're entirely sure.
Oh, okay.
I actually think that no one's been able to get the education records.
Okay.
And that's actually the really bizarre thing about it. Why would you leave before your senior year?
Right. Oh.
So why did he abruptly leave in the school year afterwards? I think that is people love to get those education records. So in 65, before he was old enough to enlist in the Navy, he enlisted in the Navy. He focused on cryptology and signals. So signals intelligence, that's intercepting electronic messages. Cryptology is code making and code breaking. His interest in code breaking kind of becomes relevant as people start to look into these classified ads and other puzzles that seem to be buried in some of his writing. So in 68, he's discharged, starts going to school at a community college in California in the Alameda area. And on June 4th, 1972, a security guard in Santa Cruz, California, was approached by a young couple who had told them that they had found a body at a beach. 17-year-old Antoinette Anino was believed to have died at midnight, according to the coroner. She had come out to the boardwalk that night with her boyfriend and his girlfriend. The two couples split, and Anino spoke with her boyfriend at a wharf. They had an argument and they split up. She didn't show up. The group searched for her. The coroner believed she had washed up, accidental drowning, and ruled it a suicide. The next night, Voss was arrested for attempting to break into the funeral home where Anino's body was located. The police report said that Voss was seen trying to enter the rear of the Willow Glen Chapel, where Antoinette was the only body present. The officer saw Voss walking from the back of the building with a flashlight in his coat pocket, a 12-inch knife on his hip, and a camera. The officer found that at the back of the chapel from where Voss was coming from, a screen had been removed from a window. So Voss told the police that he was going into the chapel to visit his girlfriend who had died one more time. And like I said, the only body in the chapel was that teenage girl, Antoinette Anina. He was charged with burglary, pled to trespass, gave a false address to them.
Yeah.
And, I think this
So
might
strange.
be, yeah. It's so unbelievably strange. This might be a good place for us to stop for the night and pick up with the rest of it.
Oh, I agree.
But I do want to share one thing as a bit of a preview for what's to come.
Yeah.
This is one of my finds after I came back from Idaho. I haven't done a lot, but I found this classified ad that Voss posted. And in it, it says, and you can see how odd it is, personal, interpersonal counseling. And that's what caught my attention. I found it by phone number. But what really, really caught my attention is, why would you use personal and interpersonal when describing counseling? It could be personal counseling, interpersonal counseling, whatever it is, but like, why both?
Right.
And Mr. Dave Vander offers personal counseling. We're saying personal again. You're paying by the word. It's classified the ad. Why are you repeating personal? Why are you even saying personal? Why are you saying interpersonal?
Yeah.
Counseling.
Spelled wrong.
Spelled wrong with 2 L's, right? For people of all ages with an accent on Christian living emphasis. Why not just say of all ages, or why not say offers Christian counseling for people of all ages, period?
Yeah, accent on Christian living emphasis.
And emphasis, right? Like, no need. Okay, individuals or groups. All right, cool. Got all that.
And 2 phone numbers again.
Yeah, 2 phone numbers again. It was all very weird. And so I called Gloria Crow-Boberts, and she was like, oh, yeah, no, he's got a friend. His friend is named Vander Does. And Allison, you'll get this. I went and I looked in the classifieds from the days before and the days after, and found a version of this classified ad where Dave's name is spelled correctly. Vander space Does. Counseling is spelled correctly.
Oh.
So someone called in and got the ad changed so it was incorrect, and it ran for 8 days after that. Ready for it?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So if you, without stepping over one letter, without using one letter twice, you've got the names of Steve Parasol. You've got the full name of Christina White in blue, Steve Parasol in Lovell. You have the last name Miller in purple. You've got Nelson highlighted in pink, and you've got David highlighted in orange.
The names of
What?
all of his victims are encoded.
Well, I mean, like, I'm not convicting him quite yet, but
It's really, and you did some math on this, yeah? I mean,
oh
you
yeah. So it was very interesting. So a little mathematician friend of mine said that if you were to take all what was it? If you were to take all, you could look at it two different ways. You could take all 27 letters and just randomly select them. What would the odds of all of those names being in there? And it's like more than 1 in 100 billion
yeah.
odds randomly selected. However, if you weigh letters for their frequency and how they're used in the English language, you're talking 1 in
Astronomical.
900 billion chances.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is yet again, and he placed this ad right after the murder, or after Antoinette. No. I'm sorry. No. I'm missing the timeline. When was this ad?
After the Lewiston Civic Theater.
Okay. Oh my goodness.
So I just wanted to give people that preview for next time because Lance is really an interesting guy. So
Yeah. And like you said, he studied cryptology, he studied code breaking, he loves these kind of puzzly things. He's also a drama man, a theater man. He likes a rousing story. He likes to play the bad guy in stories. There's so much to this guy's personality and much to what he has done or what he's been linked to. It's just
I fell over when I saw this. Like without using any two letters twice in a 25-word ad, you can find Steve Parasol, Miller, Nelson, David, and Christina White.
Yeah.
Right? The last names of the 3 victims whose bodies were found and the full names of the 2 that are missing.
Yeah.
What are the odds of that in a misspelled ad with words it doesn't need?
He calls in to have the ad spelling changed so he can fit his code in there.
Right.
Wild.
And so remember, the first day the ad runs, Vander is spelled as one word. Counseling is spelled correctly, and then it has the 2 L's. So the other thing that's really interesting for me is, so you've got 8 days of the ad running, and what do you have 7 of for the
7.
ad that ran? Steve, Parasol, Miller, Nelson, David, Christina.
Yeah.
7 names.
7 names.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So anyway, I found it very, very fascinating. And Cathy has done amazing research on it. She's the one, there's another ad that she found that's amazing, that probably relates to Christina White. But anyway, we will be back.
Yes.
And
we have much more to discuss.
Yeah, and Sam and Cathy are going to be joining us for the next episode, which will be great. I thought this was going to be 3 episodes, but I'm feeling like it's going to be longer than that.
Yeah, I was curious how we were going to try to pull this off in 3. When Snake River Killer Pod running up to 18 now. Yep. So there's a lot to this for sure. Yeah, but we will be back.
All right. We'll see you guys soon.
All right, cool.
All right. Bye.
Bye.